Jesus is better than my worries,
better than my anxiety,
my worldly desires,
better than my friends,
all of my struggles.
Absolutely everything.
Jesús es mejor que mi guitarra.
Jesus is better than my work.
Jesus is better than anything I got going on in life.
Better than my doubts.
Better than my life. Jesus is better than my struggles.
than my insecurities,
anything or anyone in my life.
Jesús es mejor que mi dolor.
Better than anything we think is good for us.
Better than any therapy.
Better than my future plans.
Jesús yo cuenta fiel.
Better than my fear of being loved and accepted.
Jesus is better than my mistakes.
Better than my future plans.
But we're glad to be with you today, and we get to get into one of the coolest chapters in the Bible. If you have a Bible, we're going to be in Hebrews 11. If you don't have your Bible or you have a smart device, you can open your Bible there. Also want to encourage you, if you do have a smart device, to open our app. Our notes are in there. You'll be able to track right along with every part of what's happening. It's a great way to it's a great way to keep engaged during the Bible study. I know how we all are. We need to be multitasking to keep our brains functioning. So feel free to open that app and to follow along with the notes in there. Even at times you'll be required to fill some things in. So we'll see how you guys do. Okay, in Hebrews chapter 11, we're going to get into, this is one of my favorite chapters, but let me just do a quick thing before we get to that. And that is this. The very end of Hebrews 10, the writer of Hebrews gives us, he says this phrase, the just shall live by faith. And this is a critical verse as we launch into Hebrews chapter 11, okay? Now, this is a quote from the Old Testament, Habakkuk. In Habakkuk, we read those words that the just shall live by faith. And then when you come into the New Testament, hundreds of years later, 3 times the New Testament says this very phrase, the just shall live by faith. But here's what I want you to notice as we launch into Hebrews 11, is that in Romans 1, well, this one's ahead, so here, let's keep it there because we're jumping ahead here. In Romans 1:17, the author says, the just shall live by, and the emphasis is faith. That it's faith that is necessary for our lives. But when you get to Galatians chapter 3, verse 11, the writer there, Paul, he wants to emphasize that the just shall live by faith. But when we come to our context today, which is in the book of Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 10, the writer emphasizes the word live. And that is, for you and me, that we are to have the kind of faith that allows us to live it out. Our faith is not just kind of a Sunday morning thing, but it's something that can go right with us into Monday and Tuesday, and you get the idea, right? And so the writer of Hebrews has left off with this idea of that the just shall live by faith. But that brings us to the question, what is faith? It's a word we use all the time. It's not just a Christian idea. We use it all the time. The just shall live by faith. And so the writer of Hebrews is going to take a whole chapter, and he or she is going to give us a whole listing of what is faith. But here's the thing about faith. Faith is easier to explain by example than it is to define. And that's incredibly important to understand. Faith is easier to understand by example than it is to define. So it's very difficult to look up in the dictionary, and you can do that, and there's a definition there, but it really doesn't give the full understanding of what it means. Well, faith equals, it's really hard to do, but what the writer here is going to do is he's going to say, let's talk about faith from the example of people that we all have heard about, okay? One more thing before we get into it, and that's this. Death is prominent in this chapter, Hebrews 11. Aren't you all excited about that, right? Now, death is prominent in this chapter. Why? In fact, it occurs more than 20 times in Hebrews chapter 11. The author wants to make it very clear that faith removes the fear of death. Faith does not eliminate death, it removes the fear of death. That which holds us hostage, fear, is no longer our enemy when we have faith. Faith is not a magic pill for suffering. Faith is not a magic pill that'll keep you from problems. The Bible doesn't describe faith in those terms. Okay? We are going to look at several different people here in the beginning of Hebrews 11, and their life story is not that they were free of suffering or free from pain or death, but rather that through it all, God was faithful. And as they believed him, they experienced a kind of victory. So faith is not a cure for pain, but it is a sustaining power for those who suffer and even for those who have died. It's also a sustaining power in our lives where we can experience God's victory. And so faith is so important. Faith is critical. Verse 1 of Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Verse 2, for by it the elders obtained a good testimony. Let me stop briefly and mention this. Faith is described here as a substance. It's a thing, though not a material thing, it's a thing. It's something substantial that we can talk about. We interact through the material world through our senses, right? Sight, touch, sound, smell, taste. Through our senses, we experience the world that we live in. But there is more in this world than what we can taste or touch or see. There's a spiritual world, the Bible describes, and it's non-material. In fact, let me just move away from just what the Bible says. Let me remind you of something. You can't taste love necessarily. You can't see the substance of love, but you experience it in other ways. If you have something in your hand, if I was, when I'm holding this bottle of water, there's something that I don't need faith because I can see this thing right now. It's right here. Faith is the sense that enables me to see without actually seeing with my own eyes. Faith is the sense that enables me to see things that are true that my eyes are not detecting. And the writer says here that the elders obtained a good testimony. Look at verse 3. By faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. And so it's one of the few times in the New Testament that somebody speaks about the idea of creation and how that creation, believing in creation is really ultimately an act of faith. When I first got saved, man, I was like, how could you ever believe in evolution and be a human? I mean, how could you ever buy into that? And I've come to, by the way, you're saying, wait, do you, just hold on. Okay. There's a lot of people who have a lot of different views and a lot of different ideas and a lot of different thoughts, and I realized all of a sudden that my beef in the end is not about whether you believe in this or you believe in that. It's about what do you believe about Jesus. And by faith, I am so convinced God made the world. God created everything that's in this world. God created you. God created me. God created us for purpose. And I believe all these things by faith. I see the unseen. Faith is not a contradiction of reason. Sometimes we say, well, if you can see it, then it's true. But if you can't and you believe it, then it must be faith. Faith is not a contradiction to reason. Faith believes in something bigger than reason. For instance, I'll give you an example. When Jesus was standing on the water, walking on water, and Peter cried out from a boat and he said, hey, Lord, if it's you, call me to come out to you. And Jesus said, okay, come on out here. There's so many easier ways to find out if that was Jesus, right? Lord, if it's really you, what did you say to me 2 weeks ago when you and I were talking privately? Right? There's an easier way to find out if it's Jesus. Asking to go walk on water is definitely the hardest way to find out if it's Jesus. But what is it that allowed Peter to walk out there? It's not reason. It is unreasonable to assume that you could walk on water. I've been to the Sea of Galilee several times in a boat, by the way. And I've been on that, and I remember a couple times, especially when I was younger, I'd be looking at like, man, wouldn't it be so cool to step out on that water? I didn't do it because it would be unreasonable to even try, right? I'd have been swimming, not walking. It's unreasonable, but it's not unreasonable to trust God. It is not illogical to trust God. Trusting God When we say that I have faith in God, we're not saying turn off your senses, turn off your logic, turn off your reason. Believing in God is not for idiots. Believing in God is seeing things beyond what is naturally logical or naturally reasonable. God is not in conflict with the world that we live in the sense that, it's constantly this battle that we seem to have that we think science is out there or is, that science is contradictory to faith. It is not. It is quite the opposite. Every time they come up with something new, it only proves the reality that there's more to this world than we've ever imagined. Science is not disproving God. It's just making it more fun to believe in God. The writer of Proverbs said this in verse 2 of chapter 25. It's the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings is to search out a matter. There's more to reality than what can be measured even in a laboratory. There's so much more to life. And so we're going to enter into, and many authors and writers, commentators have described Hebrews 11 like this giant, they always call it the Hall of Faith, playing off of the Hall of Fame, right? This Hall of Faith. But I grew up in Orange County near Disneyland, so I see something different, okay? I see something different. And once you hear what I see, you'll either think, this dude's nuts, or you'll agree with me, okay? But who's been to Disneyland before? Okay, who's been on the Haunted Mansion? No judgment, come on, who's been, okay. Some of you are like, no, I'm a Christian, I would never do that. Okay, so you go, do you remember when you're walking through and you're about to get into those carts and they have those pictures on the side of the wall, and as you're walking through, you see the beginning of the picture, but then it goes down? Yeah, here it is, right? You remember? Okay, that's this chapter. That's Hebrews 11. You'll never go to Disneyland Haunted Mansion ever the same way. This is chapter 11. It's going to start at the very top, and it's going to say, oh, Abel believed God. And then you're going to go down a little bit, and you're like, yeah, and he got killed for it. Oh, Noah trusted God. Yeah, and everybody else died. It goes from faith to it's really morbid, right? And so, by the way, I ruined Disneyland for you. God bless you. You're welcome. Okay? So we're going into what I would call a hall of faith. One person said it like this. If you're into any of these books, they put it like this. If you're a Harry Potter fan, this room we're going into is Hogwarts. I haven't seen it. I don't even know what that means. C.S. Lewis fans, it's Narnia. And if you're into Tolkien, then it's the Middle Earth. And if you don't know what those three are, I have no way to help you at this point, okay? We're going into a room. We're going to walk through a whole chapter in the Bible that's going to take us from person to situation, and it's going to expose to you and I a deeper understanding of what it means to believe God. It's filled with men and women whose stories are inspiring because they believed God. And you can't help but finish. And I hope each week we're going to spend a few weeks in this. Each week we look at this and you're going to say, wow, I'm so inspired by their lives. But inspiration alone is not the purpose that God has for His Word. It's that you and I would then put it into application, that we would apply those things. If God did it in their life, He can do it in our lives. If God was faithful then, He will be faithful now. And so in Hebrews chapter 11, we're going to see several people, and we'll just begin with just a few here. Verse 4, by faith Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it he, being dead, still speaks. So the writer of Hebrews takes us all the way back to almost the very beginning, and he takes us back to the story of Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve, the first sons of Adam and Eve. Cain was a farmer, Abel a shepherd. They both brought an offering to God. Cain brought from his garden. He brought from the fruit of his hands, his work, his efforts. He brought those things. Abel brought an animal from among his flock. And the Bible tells us that God accepted Abel's sacrifice, but rejected Cain's sacrifice. And ultimately, what does that mean? What it means is that God was saying to Cain, what you've offered is not what I have required of you to offer. You see, when man first sinned, when the first man, Adam, sinned, We're told that Adam hid from God. Adam and Eve both hid from God. And then when God came to them, we're told that they tried to cover themselves in fig leaves. But then the next thing that we read that happens is that God has clothed them in animal skin. And in order for that to happen, we understand that an animal died so that they could be covered. From the very beginning, man knew that the only way to please God was going to be through the death of someone or something else on your behalf. But Cain, instead of offering that kind of a sacrifice, Cain said, I worked hard for this. I worked every morning. I got up early. Every afternoon I kept working hard. I did this, and I'm going to bring it to God. And if God doesn't like it, and God didn't like it, because that's not what God, it doesn't do any good if God said, this is what I require, and you bring something else. God said, this is the way, this is access to me. You can't try to go another way. And that's what Cain was trying to do. Abel's sacrifice pleased God because it was made in faith. Cain's was not. So the question is this: in what way was Abel's sacrifice offered in faith and Cain's was not? And the whole way that we know this is this: God said that it's only through the death of an animal that you're going to be clothed and covered. And so Abel believed that. What's the logical understanding of that? Abel didn't have any. He just knew that's what God told him to do. He did it because it's what God said. He took God at his word and he accepted it. What Cain did is the opposite. Cain said, listen, God, I know what you've said, but look at all the hard work I put in. Day after day, week after week, season after, this is what I'm doing. These are my rituals. Why can't you accept my rituals as a means for being pleased with me? And from the very beginning, the Bible makes it very clear. No ritual is going to earn you and me favor with God. The works of our hands alone is not the way that you and I get access to God. Cain was furious about it, and so he killed his brother. So what reward does Abel get on this earth? Right? It says that, that he believed God, and what did it do for him? Nothing. He died. But he had a greater reward, and that is the promise of eternal life. He was killed very quickly. His reward then, and the first example of faith in the Bible is not of a person who believed God and then made millions. The first example of faith in the Bible is a man who believed God and died. God bless you. Have a great week. I mean, isn't that crazy? The very first time we read about somebody having faith, and they almost, from the minute they believed, the next moment, they're dead. But what's his reward? It's that this life is not the end. His reward is that he would be remembered forever as a man who believed God. Yeah, but he didn't do anything, but he believed God. Yeah, but his life was so short, but he believed God. Do you have any idea the legacy that you have in eternity when you believe God? This world may not acknowledge it. Your family might not acknowledge it. You might even forget how valuable it is. But when you trust God, you are building a bank account in heaven for eternity. Abel's legacy was not a long life. It was a life committed to believing in God. Cain was able to take Abel's life, but he could not take his legacy. Verse 5, by faith Enoch was taken away, so he did not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. For before he was taken, he had this testimony, that he pleased God. But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Enoch is one of those fun people in the Old Testament. He's kind of a mystery man. We're told that by the way, there's 4 verses given over to Enoch in the Bible, 4 verses in the Old Testament. So it's not like a whole bunch is going on there. 4 verses. Enoch, we're told, walked with God. He walked with God for 300 years. Daily he would walk with God. And we're told that he pleased God, not that he was perfect, but that he pleased God. And he pleased God so much that after 300 years, God continued. It was like every day they would go and hang out together. And then at the end of the day, Enoch would say, all right, Lord, see you tomorrow. Go home. And then the next day, hey, Lord, this is great. And they'd have relationship and connection. And then one day, God's like, you know what? Let's just continue this conversation. And he took him to heaven. One of the only people in the Bible where you have this bizarre story where Enoch did not die. Enoch was translated from this world to the next. He pleased God, and he was no more. He walked with God. By the way, he walked with God during a time when it was not easy to walk with God. I think all of us have this kind of idea that, like, I would be such a better Christian if I lived at this time. Like, if I lived then, I would be amazing. It's everybody around me. It's my circumstances. It's my situation. You know, if I was there when Jesus was there, please, you couldn't handle a lack of indoor plumbing. Come on. Let's be honest here, right? If only I lived during this time, we would have died so fast. We'd be dead at 29. Let's be honest. If as much as of our faith in God right now, that's how we are no matter what time in history we were living. There's nothing. Here's the encouragement. That's the downside. Here's the positive. There's nothing right now that is keeping you from 100% living after the things of God. There's no reason that you can't experience a totally fulfilling relationship with God, just like Enoch did. Enoch was not some kind of his time was easier and that's why he was able to do that. No, he's highlighted for you and me for a very simple reason. He's the only one. It wasn't like there was Enoch and 50 other people. He's the only one. He was believing God. Did you know this, that faith pleases God? It pleases God when you believe him. Now, here's what happens to most of us. We say to ourselves, when the big thing in my life comes, I'm going to trust God. But I know we got teachers in this room, and a teacher would remind you, you're not going to do good on the final if you didn't work on the tests leading up to it. But here's what happens for all of us. Oh, if God gives me a big challenge, I'm ready. Oh, those little ones, they're not that big of a deal. Friends, God wants you and I you're not going to please him when you pass the big test. You please him right now when you trust him. Just right now. When you believe God right now, you please him. This is incredibly important when you consider the people that this writer of Hebrews was speaking to. This was Jewish Christians who were desperately discouraged in their faith. They were really considering going back into Judaism because of just how defeated they felt as a Christian. And the author of Hebrews is reminding them, you please God when you believe him. Yeah, but look at what's happening around me. It doesn't matter. God is pleased with you. God is blessed when you trust him. God is happy when you trust him. If you want to please God first, you will find fulfillment in life, in the life that you were created for. But to please God takes faith. It takes faith to please God. It's not going to be your activity, your actions, the work of your hands. That's not going to be what pleases God. God's already shown that to be true in the story of Cain and Abel. What is it that's going to please God? It's believing him. It's trusting him. In verse 6, we are told that to please God, you must know that he is. Here's a challenge to anybody that's watching the message, okay? If you're here, if you're online, whatever, and if you are not sure that God is real, then I'm really, really encouraging you to try this out. Ask him, God, if you're real, prove it. Here's my encouragement. Get into the Bible. Oh, I don't believe the Bible. Okay, not yet. But just get into it anyways. And ask God, if you're real, show me. And you say, wow, that's a big risk. Exactly. I'll risk everything on this. I'm not afraid. In fact, by the way, let me just stop and pause for just a quick moment and say, that's part of my own testimony. I read through, God, if you're real, make yourself real to me from the Bible. He did. I saw 3D before 3D. I saw God. I felt God. I experienced God through His Word. I'm not afraid to challenge you. If you're not sure about the reality of God in your life, then ask. Who can I ask if I don't believe Him? Just make it, God, I don't even believe in you, but I'm willing to give it a try. Give God an opportunity. Instead of going through life disappointed that you're not sure about something, why don't you just figure it out? Find out, is He real or is He not? You want to please God, then you must believe that He is. That He really exists in the world that you and I live in. That right now, He is here in Chula Vista. Right? But it's more than just believing that He is. It's believing that He's the rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. If you dig for the treasures of who God is, you will strike gold. You will strike gold. Now, here's the thing. If you've been a Christian for a while and you're digging in the same spot you've been digging for 25 years, you dug that mine. You got to dig deeper. You got to keep going. Oh, that same verse doesn't feel the same way it always has. That's because you've been looking at it from the same perspective for 25 years. It's time to get a new one. It's time to dig a little bit deeper. It's time to get down a little bit deeper in your life. I'm totally convinced, with no hesitation at all, to tell you, if you seek God and ask Him, reveal yourself to me, and you will give the time to really, truly doing that, God will reveal Himself to you. He is not hiding. Verse 7, by faith, Noah, divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, he prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world, and he became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. So Noah becomes an example of faith. Noah, he lived at a time when there had never been rain. The earth, we're told, was covered in what we would describe best as like a greenhouse effect. And yet it had not really totally flooded or been covered by rain. But the world was filled with so much wickedness, and God intended to destroy the entire world, but we're told that Noah found favor with God. God comes to Noah and He says, I'm going to destroy the world. I want you to build a big boat. It's going to rain. And Noah's like, I have no idea what you're talking about, but okay. I want you to build a giant boat, but where's the body of water? Don't worry about that. It's coming. Just build it. And Noah would take 100 years to build this boat. I don't know about you, but I've had faith, and then I've lost faith. And then I've had faith, and then I lost faith. And then I had faith, Could you imagine waking up every morning, and you begin to see the outline of a boat, and you're like, what am I doing? I'm building a giant boat in the middle of nowhere. Oh, well, God told me to. Let's get back to work. And don't worry, if you didn't have self-doubt, your neighbors would give it to you for you. And I'm sure that there was thousands and thousands of people to remind Noah that he was a fool. And that's an important lesson to be reminded of. You say, well, faith doesn't make sense. It does make sense. It just might not make the kind of natural sense in the world. It still makes sense. It's no different than when your kid comes to you and they say, okay, I'm ready for school, and then you say, well, did you clean your room? And they say, why would I clean my room? I'm going to be in there later, and it's going to be messy then, and why would I clean it up? And you say, go back in there and get your room ready. And they say, you're the worst person in the whole wide world. And you say, it doesn't matter, get back in there, right? And they say, why would you make me do that? It makes no sense. And you say, it doesn't have to make sense to you. It does make sense. Believing God makes sense. There might be moments in our lives when we say, this doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. And day after day, week, month, decade, all the way to 100 years, Noah kept building the same boat. And we read this, he condemned the world. How did that happen? It happened by faithfulness. Noah was not out there preaching with like a sandwich board on him saying, get in my boat or die. Noah was faithfully doing what God had told him to do. Did you know that your life is speaking lessons when you're just faithful to doing what God told you to do? I read a great story. Actually, it's from Billy Graham in his book, his autobiography called Just As I Am. And he said he was told this story later by a friend who he was playing golf with a gentleman that did not believe in Jesus, did not believe in God. And at the end of their golf game, this guy was so upset. He was visibly upset. And as he left Billy Graham, he was kind of fuming. And one of his other, friends said, "What is wrong with you?" And the man said, "The entire 18 holes, Billy Graham crammed religion down my throat." And this man knew Billy Graham, and he's like, "Gosh, that doesn't seem like the Billy that I've played golf with. What did he say to you?" And he said, "Nothing." There's something about a life that is just well lived. Now, our goal isn't to make everybody feel bad. Our goal is listen, what brought me to faith was that longing for something more. I needed more than what I was experiencing in my life. I don't know your story, but I'll bet it's pretty similar. You knew that if you continue down the path you're going, it's going to get you nowhere. And I recognize I need God in my life. And you and I, when we trust God, we create a sense of longing in the people around us. They may not know what it means, but at some point we might get opportunity to share it. Year after decade, all the way to a century, Noah was obedient. And this reminds us of something so important about having faith in God. We can add this to the idea of what it means to believe God. It means to obey Him. You cannot say, "I believe God," without being obedient. You cannot say, because the writer tells us this. We're told in other books in the New Testament, even the demons believe. Believing is not the answer. Obedience is the expression of faith. When I really trust God, I do what He calls me to. By the way, how much did Noah's obedience affect his family? And when you think about this in your life right now, what could your obedience right now do to your family? Noah's obedience saved his family. I mean, literally saved his family. What will your obedience do in your family's life? Cousins, aunts, uncles, co-workers. Your obedience today makes a difference. Look at verse 8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place where he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out, and he did not know where he was going. Abraham was called by God to leave his hometown. God said, "Get up and go." And we're told that he did it without knowing where he was going. He had no idea where he was going, but he trusted the Lord. That takes a lot of faith. How does that sound to you guys? And by the way, you say, "Well, I would never just drive somewhere without knowing." Okay, let me ask you this. Maybe it's not about a direction like that. Maybe it's a bigger issue. Can you bear the thought of not knowing every detail before you trust God? Well, if God tells me what's going to happen, then I'll trust Him. And God would come back at you and say, then it's not trust. If you have to know everything, you're not trusting me. What God is calling you and me to is, can I believe Him even if I don't get the whole picture? Can I believe Him if I only see the top part of the Haunted Mansion picture? Will I trust God with just a little bit of information, or do I need everything before I'm willing to give myself over to trusting God? Abe did not see this. I call him Abe. Abraham. Abe did not see this with physical eyes. He saw these with spiritual eyes. This person that is calling me to trust Him is bigger than me, and He's kinder. He knows things I don't know. I'm going to trust Him. Abraham's life was set and fine. Did you know that? Abraham's life in Ur was a great place. Ur was one of the big cities of the ancient world. Ur was where the bathtub was invented. Don't we love Ur now, right? Right? It was you might not think it's modern, but back then, this was the place to be. Life was good for Abraham when God came to him and said, "I want you to go to a country that's not yours, that I'm calling you to go to. I have a place for you. I want you to get up, leave your comforts, and go." Could you do that? Now, maybe God's not calling you to do that. Maybe He is. Could you just get up and could you go? Faith is not senseless. It's informed obedience. Look at verse 9. By faith he dwelt in that land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. Verse 10, he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Abraham took up residence in a country that was not his country. It's not like Abraham moved to Canaan and said, oh, now I'm home. This is so important for you and me as Christians. Abraham did not move from Ur and move into Canaan and be like, oh, this is it. No, he moved to Canaan and he dwelt in that land, but his heart, he was holding his breath for heaven. Abraham was waiting for a city whose builder and maker was God. I know many of you know, but my wife and I have very personal firsthand experience about what it's like to move to another country and not feel like you're at home. And then we have real firsthand experience of what it's like to move back to that country that's not really your country anymore. And okay, yeah, you get the idea. Imagine that right now, you and I don't care where you're from, right now, if you and I were to say where we are right now is not home, but home is going to be where Jesus is in heaven forever. That's home. That is where home is. Now, I mean, there was a time when I was traveling quite a bit and leaving the kids, and we would go to different parts of Europe or even into Africa. And whenever I would travel and get on a plane, it was like no big deal, just get on the plane, go, whatever. Didn't really matter. But the flight home, I would always do things like, how close to the front can I get up there? Because I want to get off that thing. When we land, I want off. And usually, by the way, it never worked. But anyways, I would always try. And I would usually feel like I was in the back of the plane. And I felt like everybody was not in a hurry. You just watch as they'd open the door, from the back with the binoculars. You're like, oh, it's open. And you're standing, and you're sitting like this or standing crammed like this, trying to, and you're like, people, get your bag and get off of the plane. I'm not going to be a Christian in a minute if you don't get off this plane. Get off of the plane. Move, move, move. Why did I care? Because I was home. I wanted to see my wife. I wanted to see my kids. When I was going there, I was like, it's no big deal. I guess in the back, who cares? But as I was so close to home, and I wonder if you and I aren't experiencing some of that right now, the closer we get to being with the Lord. That feeling of like, oh, let's just get there. And I found myself, when I'm on that airplane, I don't care about none of those people. And guess what? It's not a good thing. That's a bad thing. I think that happens to us. The longer we walk with the Lord, we're like, oh man, I don't really care. I just want to get to heaven. But friends, God's called us into the world that we live in to be true lights, to be a sounding board for the world to get to know who Jesus is. And that when you get to heaven, when you take a breath in there, it's as if this world was nothing. It's just a whole new thing. That day's coming. And until that day comes, we need to be faithful. Look at what he says about Sarah in verse 11. By faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. This is one of those crazy Old Testament stories where Abraham is 100 years old, Sarah is 90 years old. 25 years earlier, God came to them and said, you are going to have a child. This is 25 years earlier. You are going to have a child. And there's this idea of like, wow, how is this ever going to happen? And now they're 190. In fact, how would you like to be described this way? Here's how God described Abraham. Look at verse 12. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead. So that's Abraham. There's Abraham as good as dead. Okay? Sarah, it was said a little nicer there in verse 11. She was past the age. That's an appropriate way to speak to a lady, isn't it? Abraham, this dude was dead, okay? But I want you to try to imagine something. I want you to put yourself back in the land of Canaan, circa the life of Abraham. And you see this old man, 100 years old, looked old. He's sitting there, sitting by a tree, enjoying the shade, and you walk over to him and you begin a conversation with this person. Hey, my name's Phil. What's your name? Abraham. Nice to meet you. What are you doing here? I am just enjoying God. Wow, that's so neat. Why? Because of my child. Oh, that's so sweet. Yeah, God promised a child, and from this child, God is going to cover the world. God's going to bless my life. Wow, that's so neat. You must have, a child and probably a whole bunch of grandkids and probably some great-grandkids because you're 100 years old. You're pretty much dead. Biblical quote. And Abraham looks at you and he starts laughing and he smiles and he goes, oh, no. I don't have any kids yet. And then you're like, oh my gosh, he escaped from one of the old folks' homes. He escaped and we need to get him back because somebody's going to be missing him soon. Right? What kind of a crazy dude at 100 years old is enjoying God because he's going to have a baby? And you're like, wow, how old is your wife? You know what? What's going on? Oh, she's 90. You're like, this guy is nuts. It makes no sense, does it? Friends, it does make sense if it's God that is the one that's telling you. It doesn't make sense if you just look at it from a logical perspective, but if you look at it from God's perspective, it makes complete sense. By the way, when God told Abraham, we're told that he laughed. Abraham laughed. And it was a kind of laugh that comes from faith, like, yes, I'm going to be a dad. That's going to be awesome. I'm so excited. And then God told this again, and Sarah heard it, and she laughed, but it was like a cackle, like a, that ain't going to happen. I'm old, and that guy's almost dead. It's not happening. And God says to Abraham, why did Sarah just laugh? And she's like, I didn't laugh. Yes, you did laugh. Yes, you did. And just for that reason, I'm not going to give you a kid. No, that's not what happened, is it? She laughed. She doubted herself. And I want to encourage you in something. And I think this is really important. If God's made a promise to you, he will be faithful to fulfill it through you and in you. And you self-doubting ultimately is a lack of faith in God. Oh, I could never do that. You couldn't do it in the first place. And your self-doubt is not making God look better. No, we believe God. And because we believe God, we believe he will use us and he will accomplish his purposes. Are we able to do it? Of course not, but that's not the point. God can do it. Verse 13, and we'll finish up in these verses for today. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, they were assured of them. They embraced them and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Verse 14, for those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Every single one of these people, Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, and Sarah, they lived in this world, but they were looking to a heavenly reality beyond this world. And how did they do so? By faith. Are you limited by what you see, by what you hear, by what you touch? Don't be. God wants you to believe him beyond what might make sense to your senses. There is a bigger sense, and that is faith, whereby I believe God in spite of me, in spite of all those things. Notice that it says that they saw the promises from afar. They saw them from a distance. Faith is like binoculars that enables us to see what is far off closer. It's a long way off, but I believe it. I know it's going to happen. Faith is built on the promises of God. Faith is not, listen, faith is not wishful thinking. It's not crossing your fingers saying, I really hope. That's not faith. Faith is looking from afar and saying, I see God is going to be faithful. God is going to do what he promised. It's based on the promises of God. Okay, what did faith look like? I would put it in these three things: seeing the promises, being assured of the promises, and then embracing the promises. In the Old Testament, we have a story of a man who was in essence kind of the prime minister, we would say at that time. And he heard the word of the Lord that the famine that was in the city was about to end. In a miraculous, supernatural way, famine was about to end. And the word of the Lord was that it was going to be over within a 24-hour period. And this leader of the community, a Jew, he looked at the man of God and he said, this is not ever going to happen. It could never happen. Even if God opened windows from heaven, it won't happen. By the way, don't you remember reading in the Old Testament God opening windows from heaven? He's already done that. So it's ironic to say even if God did that, check, he's already done that. Even if he brought windows from heaven, there's no way that it's going to happen. And here's what the man of God said to that person. He said, you're going to see it, but you're not going to experience it. And let me encourage you in something today. Don't be like that guy. We want to see the promises from afar. We want to be assured of those promises, but then listen, this is so important. You got to embrace them. Grab hold of the promises of God. What does that mean? It means don't let your life, don't just let it happen around you. Grab on to God's promises. And if you say to me right now, I don't really know many of God's promises, we'll help you. Just keep going through the Word of God with us. You're going to get to know all of God's promises. These people confessed that they were strangers on the earth, and they grabbed hold of God because they wanted more of God. Listen, this is not the end for you and me. I'm not one of those people that's going to tell you, this world doesn't matter. This world does matter. It very much matters. But you just have to remember it's not the only thing. The real thing is coming. And that's when we're going to be with the Lord forever. So the question that I want to end with this, how can I please God? It's simple. Faith. Faith grabs hold of God's promises and puts it into action. Faith grabs hold of God's promises and puts it in action. And I want to give you an opportunity right now to exercise faith. And we're going to do that through communion. Because when we partake in communion, what we are saying is this. We're saying, I'll invite the worship team, you guys come on back up. When we take the communion elements, what is this? This can be either ritual for you or this can be an act of faith. And let me suggest something to you. It is both ritual, but it also should be an act of faith. What I mean is every other week we do this. We come, we take of the cup, we take of the bread, and we say, oh, yay, let's remember Jesus. But let me remind you in a very important, critical way right now that the essence of communion is a faith commitment. It's when I say, I believe that what Jesus did on the cross is relevant for my life. In fact, it was such a strong issue for the Apostle Paul. When he described communion to the Corinthians, he said this, if you do not believe that Jesus died for your sins on a cross, was buried and rose again, if you do not believe this, then do not take communion. Why? It's just a cracker and a drink. No, Paul said, you will be heaping condemnation upon yourself. You will be burying yourself in guilt. Why? Because one day you will stand before God. Listen, here's what it looks like. One day you will stand before God and God will say to you, why did you take communion? Oh, it was just a cracker and a drink. No. That was the thing that my people do to remember me, and you don't believe me. You don't believe that I died for you. You didn't believe that I love you. You never believed it. And by partaking in that, we're heaping condemnation upon ourselves if we do not believe. Now, by the way, what's the encouragement? Believe God. It's not to go, oh man, I guess I can't take communion. No, that's not the answer. The answer is this: when you leave that seat that you're sitting in right now, do it with full confidence. I know who He is, and that He is the rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. I believe that He died on a cross for me. I believe that He was buried. I believe that He rose again, and I believe that He's right here, right now, with me. Do it in faith. Do it in faith. So as we worship the Lord, in fact, I even encourage you, you don't have to be in a hurry unless you're just super excited, then you can be in a hurry. But you can take a second and say, Lord, I believe you. I believe who you are. I accept who you are for my life. So Father, I thank you so much for the opportunity to be in your word this morning, and an opportunity for us to once again acknowledge that we believe you, and that we believe that you are the rewarder of those who diligently seek you. And I pray, Jesus, that as we partake in communion, there would be something very real for us, that it would be faith in action, not just the ritual of I get up and I partake and then I go sit down and then we get done and yada, yada, yada. No, that this morning, right now, that I would get up out of my seat as an act of faith in you, Jesus, that I believe that you died for my sins, and I believe that you conquered death, and that by me putting my faith in you, I will be with you forever in eternity. And if you have not put your faith in Jesus that way, then here's my encouragement to you. If you decide to believe him, then you come and you partake in communion. Do it as an act of first faith. I believe you, Jesus. I truly believe that my life needs to belong to you. Do it as an act of faith. Let's worship the Lord through communion. Thank you so much for being with us today. We really pray that the ministry of Calvary San Diego is strengthening and encouraging you in your faith. We would love for you to download our app and share your story of how God is working in your life. Also, if you would like to invest in the ministry of Calvary San Diego, you can financially partner with us by visiting our website at calvarysd.com/give. Thank you so much and have a great day.